1942 has got to be the darkest year in Australian modern history. We'd been at war for 3 years by then, and most of the Australian Imperial Force, our combat soldiers, were either still in the Middle East fighting the Germans and Italians, or were prisoners of the Japanese and facing years of the most horrendous incarceration. Our Navy had suffered dreadfully in the Mediterranean and in the early months of the war in the Pacific, and 40% of our trained airmen were fighting and dying over Europe. So Australia was very exposed. The war in the Pacific had broken out in December of 1941, and within weeks the Japanese had swept through the South Pacific, and Australians really felt like the enemy was on the doorstep. We'd lost a quarter of our trained soldiers when Singapore and the Malay Barrier fell, and by mid-February Darwin was bombed, Broome was strafed a month later, and they were the start of 100 Japanese air sorties over northern Australia. Through 1942, Japanese fleet submarines were operating off eastern Australia. Indeed, in the last day of March and the first day of June 1942, Japanese midget submarines got into Sydney itself. And so Australia really felt like the invasion has got to be barely a heartbeat away. By the end of 1942, however, the militia and the AIF had fought the Japanese on Australian territory in Papua, and they'd driven them back the length of the Kokoda Trail. So there was a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, perhaps. Nevertheless, they were very, very dark days. The Japanese were still in Papua and entrenched in beachheads. But if we look specifically at November and December of 1942 from the naval perspective, we're looking at a very thinly stretched force that's got a huge task: defending Northern Australia, supplying the troops that are still in contact, and desperately trying to support troops that have been left behind during the Japanese sweep through the Pacific. And that's where the story of the Armidale becomes a very significant one.